Well, it sounds like we're live, so
Right on.
let's keep rolling.
Sounds good. Well, Nick, I first found you on YouTube, and so I'll share a little bit about what what kind of brought you to my attention. And basically, probably the algorithms did the work, but when I found you, what I first heard from you was mostly talking about uh, the approach that you've taken to helping people understand ways to build a guidance business. And I've sort of been in this creator economy space for a bit, hearing from all kinds of creators about different business models. And there's a lot of common language that any sort of subculture starts to adopt and I would say overutilize. And so what I really appreciated about you right off the bat was how you could enter into a category of common language, but you were searching and looking for your own language and asking, how do these words really feel to me? And what does this really feel like it's pointing toward? And how does it resonate? And that's really important to me because I think that's one of the fundamental problems that we face in culture and communication is we are very habitual creatures and group-minded beings, and so we can sort of fall into these um, grooves that may or may not continue to serve the right purposes to, live according to our values. So, you talked about the idea that a lot of people are encouraged to become a coach, and the word coach has become very commonly used, or the word personal brand, which these words serve their function, but you invite people to ask, maybe there's another approach, maybe there's a different way of speaking about these things. And you also used the term transpersonal brand, which I also liked. So maybe we could start uh, exploring this a little bit. Um, what brought you, or maybe I could ask you, what do you think uh, brought you to have the mindset of wanting to sort of investigate how language is used and how it feels to you, and what made you have that sort of approach and attitude about testing the waters and trying things on and finding your own language for things?
Yeah, well, I can definitely share what I felt was there consciously, right? Because there's also like other drives that potentially I'll unpack here, or will still be unavailable to me. And and I guess I'll preface that by saying that I've always been curious about language. Like language is something that I've always enjoyed learning. Back at school, and I speak several foreign languages. I mean, English is my foreign language; it's my second language, and so for me, language is like an entry into not necessarily a different world, but a different way of seeing the world, right? Because I mean, if you use different languages to describe the same thing, they will mean slightly different things just because of the language structure. And European languages might be closer, but if you take something like Japanese already, there's a whole different syntax around possessive language, right? There's something like you don't say "I have hands," you say "there are hands" or something like that. And whereas English, for instance, is very like "I have hands," "I have a headache." It's very like about possession. So that already kind of influences our perception and ways of looking at the world. So I've always enjoyed playing with language, right? Kind of seeing, okay, how does my perception change if I use a different language? And some of it came from my early days in going into neurolinguistic programming, for instance, which is a branch of coaching where you kind of use words to influence the subconscious, to simple exercises like, what if I started to say thank you instead of sorry? Like I lived in London for ages, and like the word sorry is just overused, and I think in Canada too, and maybe that's the echo of the British Empire. I don't know, but there's almost like there's too much sorry where people don't even mean it, right? It's just a matter of politeness, to the point that I feel the word sorry begins to lose its value or its strength, right? Because you can say sorry because you forgot to keep the door open for someone, but that'll be the same word you use to say sorry because, I don't know, you cheated on someone or you stole something. And it is a different energy, right? So I started to say thank you instead. Like if I was late, instead of saying, oh, sorry, I'm late, I said, hey, thanks for waiting. Thanks for being patient. Or thanks for understanding. Like I was, in a difficult situation. And that's already a different language reframe. And there are many, many examples like this. I won't go into this, or we can go into them later. But to answer your question, I mean, I came into this world of, let's say, content and branding and creating online because this is the world I really love, right? It's the world of media. It's the world of expression. It's the world of words, but also potentially images, videos. So there's so many different mediums that kind of play together here. So there's a lot of possibility, right? Because of the richness of the medium, so to say. But of course, as I came in, right, there's part of it is kind of trying to understand the game that's already being played, because while it is very free, let's say, like on social media, you will look at certain people that are kind of ahead in terms of following, and you will look at their language, right? Their language structures. What are they doing? How are they phrasing their thoughts, right? Like, and everyone will have a kind of unique style. You cannot say that everybody, might sound the same, but you're absolutely right that, in some bubbles, like the creator economy, for instance, there tends to be an overlap in like the terms that are being used, even if they're synonyms. And for me, that was a challenge because, of course, maybe that's an ego thing, or maybe that's just like the desire to kind of break out and find something new. I wanted to create something unique, right? I didn't just want to create another thing that sounded exactly like someone else's. So for me, that was already an exercise of, okay, what is there that I feel that is true, that exists, that has not been named yet, right? And that's really, for me, an exercise of putting words on experience, on energy, right? And sometimes it's as simple as taking an existing concept and adding a little twist, like personal brand already exists, but there's also transpersonal psychology. Both have the word personal in it, right? But nobody really talks about the transpersonal brand. And I'm like, that's interesting. What would that mean? I feel there's something here. It's, it's not just, suddenly two words glued together, right? There's a depth here, but it's still to explore, still to define. And that's why I ran some spaces, some live conversations like this. Partially, it's a business move because, of course, we differentiate ourselves when we create new terms, right? There is a bit of strategy, there's a bit of tactics in this too. And part of it is also because I didn't find my own identity in the existing language. For instance, when I was working as a coach, I didn't enjoy being called a coach, or there was so much stigma around coaching that I felt myself that I wanted to use different terms. And so guide kind of felt more freeing. So for me, language can offer freedom, right? Especially when we go into new territory. And if you open a business book 101, usually they'll talk about the blue ocean strategy, which is, you want to create products where there's no competition, right? You want to go to the blue ocean when it's basically empty and you have all the fish to catch, rather than the red ocean where there's like, 20 ships fighting over the same little fish. And in the online space, our products are usually words by definition, right? Because it's content, because it's media. So for us, the blue ocean is the new language that we use, is the new terminology. And of course, we need to back it up with experience, with conviction, with definitions. But at the end of the day, I feel that's, when we invent the new language, and it's not that I'm reinventing English, right? I'm just kind of adding a few words here and there. That's when we begin to find our corners of the internet that feel authentic to us, feel right to us, but also at the same time start to invite people into that little corner that we're creating. And so yeah, I suppose it was a combination of those curiosities and just the love for languages and playing with them.
Yeah. Yeah, I like those examples. And it would make sense that having that background of having experience with different spoken languages would be part of the awareness of that kind of nuance of meaning. So that also brings up the topic of travel, because not only is language something we speak and read and write, but it's something we enact and we see, right? There's all these other forms of language. And so I'm curious because to me, travel is also very important personally. And maybe that's partly just like an inner restlessness. But it's also, I really appreciate seeing the depth of different ways of seeing and different ways of communicating, different styles of creativity and expression. So it seems like you have had quite a chapter of life of exploring different parts of the world. I saw a video from you about what it's like to be a digital nomad. And so it seems like now you're sort of finding yourself with somewhat more planted feet. I know you have some travel plans ahead, but yeah, what's that been like, navigating inwardly, like this question of where you want to be and what have different places meant to you on that journey, and then maybe now being in Italy, what's it what's it what's it meaning to you inwardly, or how is it affecting the way you're existing?
Yeah, yeah. Travel has been, an incredibly enriching experience, and it's interesting. After all this travel, now I find rooting down and slowing down an incredibly enriching experience. So I think there's always like the pendulum is kind of swinging, right? And yeah, I mean, I grew up moving, right? I grew up kind of nomadic. I was born in Sweden, then lived in Russia, then Finland, then Russia again, then Belgium, then the UK. And then I went fully nomadic by myself and going to Costa Rica, Mexico, Spain, India, Sri Lanka, many other places. And I've really been nomadic since 2021. And only now I'm really staying longer in places. And yeah, it's you're absolutely right that you kind of you get to see the world differently, because you also get to see yourself in different situations and in different places. And I really generally believe that places have a kind of soul or a kind of energy, if you will, and just by being there, it brings something different out of you that it wouldn't have otherwise if you were in the same location. Or it would take something for that to happen. Like you'd probably have to watch a movie that really immerses you into a similar energy, or a book or a story. And whether that is, that's the explanation, or whether it's just the environment is incredibly different, right? If I go to a mountain town in the Himalayas, like I'm walking and there's a lot of honking, right? There's kind of hectic traffic. People talk this language that I don't really understand in a different tone. They have different gestures, right? Even like moving the head. Then there's all these cows. Then there's all this, Hindi written that I cannot read. All these colors, all these smells, all these textures. I'll feel very differently there compared to, let's say, a very polished street of Copenhagen, where it's dark gray sky, and yeah, it's those cute 2-3 story buildings, but everybody's wearing their kind of let's say Nordic outfits that are very clean and very polished, and there's not much room for chaos, right? So I feel places really shape us, and of course, if we spend a prolonged amount of time somewhere, it also kind of begins to shape our personality. And and so I've always enjoyed kind of observing what I notice in the place, but also what I observe in myself and how I change when I come to a place. And it's not so immediate, of course, because I feel it takes time to even notice that you're in a different place, right? We kind of fly to a place and we might be hit by this high of like, oh, it's so amazing to be here. But really, our soul, quote unquote, hasn't really arrived there, right? And it takes maybe a week or two to really become even present in that new place. So yeah, and at this point, I've landed in Italy, as you mentioned, in the south, in Puglia, which is a very beautiful region and has a lot of history. I mean, Italy in general has, incredibly rich history. The whole peninsula, Puglia is, has been kind of the bridge to the east. So you can take the ferry to Greece, so you can feel the Greek influence here. There's the influence of the Byzantine Empire. Even the Christian icons, they tend to be more of the older Byzantine style rather than the kind of more modern Catholic classical icons. You can see that in the ceramic culture here. This land has been ruled by many different empires, including the Spanish ones and even the French for a little while. So there's kind of also, it's the South, but it's a very rich South that has been through a lot, maintains that Italian culture, but has so many different flavors. Not to the same extent as Sicily, for instance, which is even the next level, I would say. But I really enjoy that, and I really enjoy being in a place that has um, so much history, so much soul. That can mean sometimes, in cases of Italy, that it's a more traditional country, and we're not talking maybe about the traditionalism we might find in a very kind of extreme kind of Muslim cultures, right? Like if you go to a village in Afghanistan, for instance, right, the tradition might be even stronger. Here, there's still, maybe more liberal views, but here is not maybe as free as in Amsterdam or in New York, in terms of people's expression or how they dress or a range of these societal kind of factors. But in today's world where I feel culture is changing so quickly and is so malleable, I feel there's something beautiful also in places that manage to maintain their tradition. And maybe I romanticize about it because again, I grew up kind of moving around and I come from a culture, of course, but is never so kind of conservative. And I know for people that grow up in these traditional families, it can be really difficult, right? Because it's so kind of constricting. But there's also something beautiful because I feel the same values tend to continue to matter generation over generation. And maybe the ways of enforcing those values are sometimes questionable. But the beauty of, things persist over generations is something that I find, quite beautiful or quite attractive. And that's something I see here, and something I see lacking even in the UK, for instance, or Anglo-Saxon cultures, where I feel the culture didn't survive as well somehow. Yeah, at least that's my take. I wonder if you agree with that, or what comes up for you.
Yeah, well, a lot comes up there because as a journalist, I sort of see it as my job to try to weave a lot of things together cohesively so we can talk about many topics, but a sort of central theme that I feel like is the maybe the main overarching topic of our conversation might be something like how do we be in the world? And that's super general, so that could mean we talk about business because if you're going to make a living outside of having jobs, then you talk about business. How do you operate and create value? But it brings up politics because that's about values and sharing space with other humans. It brings up language and culture and place. So yeah, I mean, I've grown up basically in Canada and the United States, and I was raised in sort of the basically the Protestant worldview. and then sort of became a seeker. Let's say, I went through like an atheist phase and then started asking deeper questions about consciousness and language, and sort of became spiritual. And then I returned to Christianity several times with different layers of interpretation, different levels of appreciation of history and of symbolism and psychology. And so I sort of went from this sort of naive version of conservative values, I would say, as a child, to kind of becoming very liberal leaning. And, I was maybe 12 years old when Occupy Wall Street was on TV. And, I became very skeptical of tradition, skeptical of authority and hierarchy. And then again later, after my initial stages of spiritual seeking, again gained more appreciation of tradition and the richness and depth of stories and value systems that live on generation after generation. And so I sort of see it that same way, where it's like you can you can appreciate that there's so much depth there, and at the same time it's kind of a dilemma that, if you're born in one place, you're sort of given access to a certain worldview, a certain value system, and encouraged not to question it too much. Or you might be born in a place where you're encouraged to question everything and dismantle all value systems, and that can be freeing, but it can also be disorienting. And so, yeah, I'm also interested in talking with you about the different philosophical influences or intellectual influences, because I know there's probably many for you. And so maybe we could rewind a bit to some earlier influences. I imagine you've studied a few different philosophical traditions. And then I know that in your current life, you're investigating some ideas and evaluating. And so, yeah, I think that might be a good entry point to ask you, what are the wisdom paths or traditions or intellectual, um, thought worldviews that have been influential to you? And then, yeah, has that been a challenge to kind of orient, being someone who's so open to exploration and questioning values, and yet also someone who appreciates the beauty and depth of tradition? How have you navigated that?
Yeah, that's a really big one. And yeah, I feel with influence, I might not even be able to name those that really, or at least like all of those that influenced me, because I feel, it's such a process of osmosis that, sometimes I read one thing here, another thing there, or it might be an idea recycled or reinterpreted by someone, but actually it's an idea from someone else. So yeah, but if I had to name a few kind of big influencers, let's say, in my life, probably Carl Jung is one of them for sure. Just, not necessarily going through all of his work, word by word, and reading all the books that I do find a bit dry at times.
There's a lot.
From beginning to end, but resonating in general with the worldview that he has, or not even the worldview, but the way he sees a human psyche, right? From archetypes to the collective unconscious, the shadow, and many, many other terms that he kind of coined or at least developed further. Whereas Freud, for instance, I never really resonated with as much. I think he did, made a lot of interesting theories, but I do feel that we're a lot more reductionist. So yeah, Jung would definitely be one of them. Then, I did have a big chapter of diving into Buddhism when I went onto my own spiritual journey, and that was kind of my first, let's say, framework of reference, because once I open up to all this experience, it's kind of hard to put words on it, right, or to find language around it. So Buddhism offered me a useful lens that at the same time didn't feel too restrictive, even though it did feel maybe overly logical too sometimes. Um, and then, eventually also Hinduism and Advaita Vedanta, non-duality, and, the teachings of someone like Rupert Spira or Spira, depending how you pronounce his surname. Those were very useful, at least when it came to interpreting the nature of reality and understanding, the kind of metaphysics, so to say. And in that stage, there was definitely, listening to Ram Dass, also Alan Watts, and those kind of, I wouldn't call them New Age gurus, but, those charismatic speakers at the forefront of the New Age movement, so to say. But, I come from the Russian culture originally. I was also shaped by the Russian literature, the works of Dostoevsky and Tolstoy that I still come back to and read. So there's also a particular way of looking at psychology or humanity or, the human life through that lens. And then, and then many other influences. I probably partially owe it to my mother, because she was or is still very spiritual and very open-minded spiritually. So, even though both parents are from Christian Orthodox background, she had a lot of books on different esoteric traditions, and that helped me explore that, with curiosity. And I, sometimes, whether it was exploring Buddhism or now kind of recently coming back more to the Christian Orthodox Church, I still have a craving in me to just commit to one framework or one way of looking at the world. And I don't know if it's such a logical decision. It probably is a question of faith. You just, kind of suddenly feel this is right, or, God speaks to you in your dream, and then you're like, okay, the path was Christian Orthodox all the way, like Paul Kingsnorth. I'm kind of, simplifying it a lot, but that's sort of been his comeback to Christianity, or, going into Orthodox Christianity in particular. So yeah, sometimes there's a wish of like, I'm very open-minded and I hold all these beliefs loosely, and I do have this very non-dual perspective and see all these religions, but yet I feel with my toes in all these different waters and not really belonging to one particular, not even school of thought, but it's probably more of a community or a set of values, right? Because it feels like a very individualistic thing to be like, I guess I like the precepts in Buddhism. I guess I like the myths in the Bible from Christianity. I guess I like, the non-dual perspective and the paradoxes of Zen Buddhism. And maybe that's a very creative work to kind of just, hold that all together and write perennial philosophy like Aldous Huxley did, or, go into integral theory frameworks of Ken Wilber. But I feel it's a bit disconnecting to, or there's not enough ground to stand on. So yeah, maybe as I grow older, I will sort of commit to a path, or the path will sort of make me commit to it. I don't know. My brother, for instance, is, he's 19, but he's incredibly religion and committed to his Christian faith, which, I could argue there's that movement happening in the Gen Z generation. There's a certain influence there, but it's also really beautiful. And I never experienced it that way. So yeah, I feel that, probably with age, we do come back more to tradition and values. I do think there's a correlation for sure. And I read, I think it was Naval Ravikant, or someone like him, who said that Democrats might often or will become Republicans, but it's very rare that a Republican will become a Democrat. and there's some truth in that. Maybe there's, I feel there's a lot of rebellion in the younger age against the system, against the tradition, against this, and it's that, seeking identity, seeking expression, but sometimes, not always, there's kind of coming back to the traditional values and, kind of valuing something that has been there over generations. And Democratic and Republican Party are, politics is a completely different game. But just as a reference to sort of different values, I feel they represent something. So yeah, that's where I find myself.
Well, I find that journey very relatable, because yeah, I share this, diverse range of interest in all these different modes of thought. And I'm 30 now. My 20s were full of exploration, altered states of consciousness, and travel and philosophy, um, and now I don't necessarily feel I have a resting place philosophically, a place to call home, and I don't necessarily consider that a problem, but I see the I see the value. We have limited time, we have limited energy, and so we have to have some priorities and value structure, and also one of the problems I do see with sort of the postmodern era of seeing everything as holding some truth and nothing as having the ultimate truth is the lack of community value, right? So, okay, if we all just have this openness to endless exploration, how do we live together? How do we accomplish things together? And so we mostly don't, right? That's where you have this very individualist culture in America, and there was the hippie era of trying to live on communes and things like that, and uh, there was some shared values in like back to the land, caring for the earth, but there was also still this very individualist, freedom-loving attitude, um, that sort of rejected all conformity. And so that does feel like a bit of a problem to me personally, right? Like we might be able to describe how it could be a problem on a society level, um, but it also just feels like a problem personally because I lack that sense of community. And sometimes I envy people who just go to church on Sundays and they're part of a particular church and they don't even really care to question the theology or the system at work. It's just like this is functioning. I have my faith, and so I find I kind of bother people when I go into any particular domain, and I might say, yeah, I believe in sacredness, and I believe in even a higher power, and there's certain things I hold to be true. But then a lot of it, when it comes down to a lot of the specifics, I'm very skeptical and I have trouble committing to anything and truly believing, and I won't let myself pretend to believe something. Um, so that's where I have been curious about the Orthodox tradition, partly because from what I have heard about it, it does leave open a lot of room for mystery and unknown. At the same time, it is a tradition with certain sort of ritualistic, ceremonial, routines, let's say, which again, that's difficult for me to accept and adhere to. But I can appreciate that from what I understand, it's a little bit more non-prescriptive in terms of truth claims about like, where everyone's going to go in the afterlife, let's say. Because that's one thing I would have a hard time with a lot of the Christian ethos is the idea that I'm supposed to make a claim about what's going to happen to other people's souls, and I don't have any I don't have any conviction that I can make such claims. Um, But another topic that's kind of wound up in all this, and I think Paul Kingsnorth sort of comes up here, who I'm not very familiar with, but I know you've been reading his work. Um, this postmodern age, let's say, of sort of disintegrated value systems, it's also led to a lot of innovation that we all utilize in our day-to-day lives. We all carry supercomputers in our pockets now. And there's something really incredible about that. It presents us with all this opportunity and immense power in some sense as individuals. Uh, so the leverage that I have as an individual to build a business using the internet is sort of like never before. You know, I don't need a ton of startup capital to get a bunch of supplies and land and access to a storefront or whatever. And yet, this technology also has a lot of us feeling anxious and concerned about what it means for the future, what it means for the stability of career paths. Um, so maybe you can tell me a little bit about, am I right that Paul Kingsnorth is sort of exploring that realm a little bit, or is it, can you tell me a little bit about him and what he writes about?
Yeah, for sure. I do feel that I've been reading about Paul Kingsnorth for the last month or two, and I have to give credit to your guest on the show. Is it David McKenna?
Dennis McKenna.
Yeah, and who I've really enjoyed listening to before on podcasts, so I was really happy to see who was on your show. And yeah, he mentioned Paul Kingsnorth by the end, and he actually said Paul Kingsworth, I think. So I had to Google, and it was a slightly different name. But anyway, I found the work he was referring to, and I listened to an interview he did with the New York Times, an interview I also really enjoy. So I recommend to start there if you're not familiar with his work, and that's a great entry before diving into his book, which is a sizable volume. And then I found his audiobook, which is not narrated by him, but a voice that's very similar and very eloquent. And I started listening to that audiobook in November, and I finished maybe a month ago or so. And I listened from beginning to end. And it's very rare that I go through an audiobook completely, and it's like 7 hours. And it's great because some ideas are not repeated, but re-emphasized. So even if my mind wanders and I'm too ADHD, because often I listen while driving or doing something or cooking, then there's still the possibility to sort of come back to the idea. So yeah, Paul talks a lot about the machine. His book is called Against the Machine, on the Unmaking of Humanity, if I remember correctly. And I've listened to a few more podcasts with him, and I feel like I get a pretty good sense of his worldview and his story too. And again, I being a selfish, individualistic bastard, I don't fully agree with everything he says, but I find a lot of it very, very interesting and very compelling as an idea, right? And in particular, what I found helpful. And of course, there's a lot more context, but he talks about the 4 Ps and the 4 Ss. And, rather than being a corporate strategy framework, is actually a very, very useful one. So the 4 Ps are people, place, prayer, and past. So people, like community, place, right? So like a physical place, prayer, like a kind of religious devotion, I guess, or having a religious worldview and being committed to a path of faith. And then past, which is that history does matter and ancestry does matter, where we've come from does matter, right? It's not just something to be rejected, as we might find ourselves doing in the postmodern world, or when screw the past, let's live in the future or today. And then those 4 Ps are kind of like an antidote to the 4 S's. And the 4 S's are sex, self, science, and screen. And and there's a very interesting one. I mean, sex is, he talks a lot about, especially sexuality as in identity, like sexual identity. So the overemphasis on, sexual orientation and using pronouns, again, gets maybe slightly political. But he does talk about also the kind of sexual liberation, right? Like in the 60s, or how suddenly like one of the highest values became, sexual expression and finding that sexual enjoyment. But, it was just, sex for the sake of sex, right? Or kind of the pleasure, the hedonistic treadmill. And then there's the self, which I found the most interesting one, because it doesn't seem like such a, like sex I can understand. Yeah, sex addiction is there. People, struggle with porn addiction. And, but self is like, what's wrong with self, right? We kind of, we talk about self-discovery and, and self-expression, and he actually views it as, at least the kind of overemphasis on the self prevents us from building communal bonds, right? Just like you were saying, right? That we, us being so in this kind of individualistic mindset, which I'm sure is sometimes a defensive mechanism too, where we have to question, or we don't necessarily agree, or we are, or at least like I can speak for myself, I'm afraid to belong somewhere, so I'll disagree, or I'll choose to feel different, right? And that prevents these communal bonds, which probably are vulnerable, right? Or require the vulnerability to kind of surrender to feeling part of a community. And then everything becomes like a marketplace of personal choices, right? Like, buy this, and obviously brands, right? Like I'll wear this brand, I'll wear this watch, and my haircut is like this and like that because I'm like this. And so there's this overemphasis. And I really saw myself in that. Like, I think that's one that hit the hardest. But even in the tools that I build sometimes, right? A lot of it is, I kind of champion like self-awareness, because I believe that people get to know themselves will be helpful to them. But actually, having spent thousands myself on retreats and astrology sessions and whatnot, trying to always understand myself, is almost like a never-ending obsession that might have something there, but is like, doesn't have an end. And then there's science, which again is not a kind of negative thing on its own, but when science is then used as a weapon of truth, right? Like what happened with COVID, for instance, or it can get very conspiratorial. It depends on your views, but it's true that science can be manipulated. Science is never the absolute truth, because it's ever evolving, right? The science of today disproves a lot of the science from the past. But when people or governments or institutions start to use science as weapons, that's when it's dangerous. And then screens, which is a pretty obvious one. I think that, screens are just incredibly addictive, especially phones. And it's just this portal that, sucks you in and kind of takes a lot out of you. So yeah, that's his framework of looking at it. And of course, there's more depth and, more that he looks at. But there's something that really resonated for me there. Before maybe championing the 4 S's, maybe not so much science. I've always been a bit skeptical of relying too much on science. But, the importance of the 4 Ps, right? Because I feel we live in such a world that we are disconnected from community, we're disconnected from a place. Also, the digital nomad lifestyle is a very extractionist, not necessarily, but it can be an extractionist way of living, right? Because you go to places and you it's not that you necessarily take and extract. Of course, you experience and you can contribute and you can argue, spend money in that local economy, and you share your knowledge there. So you can still be very kind of synergetic and, an exchange, but it's still very disorienting. And then, the importance of prayer, the importance of the past, like the past where, people don't know the history or kind of just reject it outright. So I found that useful. And Paul he went deeply into the Christian Orthodox Church now, even though before he was following Buddhism, then he was a Wicca practitioner, or following the kind of more occult practices, and he found himself kind of following the Christian Orthodox Church. But something that stayed with me, and maybe that's my personal projection, and I'm reading too much into it. One of his recent posts, he admitted or said or disclosed that he was suffering from a burnout. That writing this book took a lot out of him, and I can understand it's a very big topic. It's and in a way he's fighting the machine, and fighting the machine also takes energy. But it kind of almost made me wonder that here he is kind of trying to reject technology and like this modern way of living, and yet it's very hard to keep up with the world, right? To write his book, to feed his family, to do this, and like I think he doesn't own a smartphone, or he's not on social media, and again, maybe I'm reading too much into it. Of course, I can be also burnt out, maybe even more with all the code agents and OpenClaw and trying to keep up with what's happening, and so it's not about that, but I do feel that choosing not to obey or to really follow the machine is probably quite a difficult life too, and it comes with its own challenges. And sometimes I don't know if I'm ready for that. Maybe I'm still in the young mindset of I can have it all, or I can hack, and that's the paradox of using the machine to live the unmachined life that I talk about. And I definitely feel there's naivety there, and is not quite so simple. But at the same time, I don't know if I'm completely ready to sort of reject the machine and what it has to offer, even though it's a very tempting offer of the devil to kind of go for the full unmachined life. So that's the tension that I sit with, and I'm curious where you find yourself in that, in relation to that.
Yeah. Well, one of the thoughts that comes up is that there's a teacher I had when I was at university for a while who, personally, he was Anglican, but he was very influenced by a lot of different thinkers, the Inklings like C.S. Lewis, and also different contemplative thinkers like Thomas Merton or Bede Griffiths, who studied Hinduism quite a bit, and I think he was maybe Catholic, but he was sort of like a Hindu Catholic, which might sound pretty strange, but lived in a monastery at one point. And he also often this teacher would talk about George Grant, who I think may be the person who he drew the idea from of living in the tension, to live a contemplative life.
Hey, Jesse, I think I lost the audio. Can you still hear me? Could it be something with your mic, or is it on my end?
If anyone can comment.
Okay, now I can hear you.
Okay.
Did you do something, or?
I didn't do anything.
Okay.
Oh.
Yeah, there was like the noise of a frequency, and then suddenly I lost you. But now it's back.
Olivia just said no sound. Oh, okay now. Okay, something happened. Seems like we're good. So, yeah, one of the thinkers this teacher would mention sometimes is George Grant, and I think it was he who was the one who talked about the idea that to live a contemplative life, you have to be willing to live in the tension, and sort of the tension of opposites, or the tension of seemingly opposing viewpoints, perspectives, lifestyles, values. And so I appreciate that about what you're saying. Like, it is a dilemma that I think a lot of people are facing right now, asking themselves, okay, so I want to be a digital entrepreneur and I want to live off grid and be a homesteader. It's like, okay, well, which is it? Can you do both fully? I mean, there's limited time and energy. And homesteading, like you're saying, like for Paul Kingsnorth, like to be sort of fighting the machine takes a lot of energy. And to be a homesteader, as an example, is a very committed lifestyle. And, you know, to have a family and be a homesteader, like that's going to take all your time and energy. So then can you also be keeping up with like running a podcast and creating all these digital offers, and maybe not. Uh, so it's a dilemma that I face personally. And there was another teacher I studied with who was quite different from the one I mentioned, who is Anglican. This other teacher was a lot more influenced by Buddhism and Eastern philosophies. And he introduced me to a book called Hojoki, and really amazing book, one of my favorites ever. And it's a short read. It's maybe like 70 pages of simple stanzas, basically, kind of a poetic style. And it was written by a guy who I think was in 12th century Japan, and his name was Kamo no Chamai. And he writes about all these calamities that took place in his lifetime in Japan: earthquakes, famines, floods, like so many things happened. I think it was during the century that the capital changed, maybe from Kyoto to Tokyo, or at least at the time, I think it was Kyoto, and a bunch of terrible things happened there. And some of those calamities led to, and even like a plague, uh, so that, you know, it led to him having to witness a lot of suffering. And also, he was engaged in politics at one point in his life, and so he had a very public life, and he wrote about this dilemma of public life and how it entangles you, and how you end up at odds with people, and you end up being pulled in different directions. And the book Hojoki, the title I believe refers, oh, it's Hojoki, an account of my hut, I think. But he talks about his 10-foot square hut, and throughout the story, he slowly retreats from public life. He retreats from society to a reclusive life, and smaller abodes, until finally, in his elder years, he's living in this 10-foot by 10-foot hut. And he has very few possessions, and you know, like one set of clothing, and like maybe a teacup, and like a lute to play some music, maybe a little book of prayers. Very simple. And yet he's still faced with dilemmas, whether it's loneliness or whether it's this troubled mind because he thought, oh, if I go and retreat into this reclusive life, I'll be able to be so pure, and I won't be tempted by my sinful nature anymore. And he finds, no, still, at least there's no one there to shame me for it, but my mind is still impure. And so it's sort of this do you want a dilemma or a predicament question? You know, do you want to live the public life where, and one line that is memorable, if I can remember it somewhat accurately: if you conform to the world, it will bind you hand and foot, and if you do not, it will think you mad. And so it's sort of, no matter which way you go, you know, you might think the grass is greener elsewhere, or you're going to be faced with yourself either way. So that's part of what comes up for me, is that a contemplative life requires that you live in the tension, but then is there a way to find ease, fulfillment, satisfaction, where you're not constantly pulled in multiple directions in that tension? And I don't know, you know, maybe it has to do with being willing to follow the pendulum a little bit. Like, okay, if you're a traveler type of person, maybe you settle in place for a time, and then you travel again. And maybe you engage with public life and you engage with the world of politics, and then you also retreat to the mountains at times and retreat to solitude. I suspect that that's probably what will continue calling to my soul for the time being, is having to do some of both.
I think I'm losing your audio again. Maybe there's an interference with your mic or something, like another device.
I'm going to unplug something else here. I might have to try a different cable.
I can hear you now, so yeah.
Okay, we'll give it another shot for now. But yeah, this question of like, if you're living in the tension, can you find a place of relief from that tension? And I suspect that in my life, I'll continue swinging back and forth a little bit, retreating to solitude and then engaging in public life. And this also brings up for me, sort of a metaphysical question. And you mentioned the 4 Ps and the 4 S's. And when you were talking about self, I thought that's very interesting. You know, we place a lot of importance on ourself because that's me, like, you know, looking out for number one, they say, right? But a lot of the spiritual traditions are partly about overcoming self or transcending self and being in service to other. And I think there's a lot of satisfaction and fulfillment in being of service to other. So I almost wonder if part of this faith question is about releasing the need to know, like, for example, what happens to me after I die, right? We have this natural anxiety about our mortality. And in the Judeo-Christian ethos, there's the first myth is, you know, we became aware of our nakedness and aware of our mortality. I mean, the story says we became mortal, but I sort of read it as possibly referring to the idea that, you know, we are aware of our mortality, and that's a predicament. But maybe part of the relief from that is this self-transcendence. If we can overcome ourselves in service of something greater, then maybe I don't get to know the ultimate answer, the ultimate truth. And so that's what makes it very hard for me to engage in a particular tradition and stay committed to something and plant my feet. And yet I long to be able to plant my feet and be in service of something more sustainably. So that's kind of an open question. I'm not sure if it brings up some thoughts for you, but, you know, maybe that's part of it, is releasing the need for myself to know and instead allowing this self-transcendent state where it's like, okay, I'm willing to be in service of community despite my criticisms of any given tradition or community, or my skepticism of it.
Yeah, I mean, it brings up a lot. I mean, everything that you shared, and I particularly resonate with how, to live a contemplative life is to live with tension, or to be in that tension, or to become comfortable with that tension. And I do feel that's where the richness is, because, ultimately we kind of probably, because our mind is limited in a way, but we do get into these paradoxes, and then you just cannot explain, or both views are true. And that's where I found a lot of richness in the Zen tradition, for instance, just to come back to the, spiritual traveling and borrowing from traditions. But it's very rich because it's very poetic, and there's very, it doesn't attempt to explain Zen, right? And, Zen that can be put into words is not Zen, or whatever they say, or all these koans and all these kind of paradoxical truths. And I feel there's a lot of richness, because that is something that is not there, for instance, generally especially more in the Western Christian faith, right, or tradition, where it's very hard coded, like, right, this is how it is, go to the Bible, this specific verse, there's this, code, there's this prayer. And it almost leaves no freedom for the mystery, as you said. And then, how the Christian Orthodox tradition is, at least in theory, more open to it. And I do believe that to be true. But as a religious institution, it can still be rigid too, or, can kind of be fixated on a particular view. And yeah, I feel that, I do feel there's richness in that tension. And that brings up the bigger question of, what is even tension and how to be with it, even, in the inner experience, right, in the somatic experience, because I feel so much of it is, tension and release, and probably on average, I do believe we hold a lot of tension already, right, in our body, and just kind of tensing up. And even, through my work of exploring somatic therapy, or even, the neo-tantric work of sexuality that Paul Kingsnorth would probably disagree with, there's, even sexually, we're very tense, right? Like, even as men, for instance, we're not able to really open our bodies or to have multiple orgasms, because we kind of build up this tension and then we release quickly. And whether it's through sexual exploration or not, it doesn't have to be, but just being able to, I feel, be with tension and to relax into tension, whether it's an intellectual, mental tension, also is where there's a lot of richness there. And that's something I believe, but I don't necessarily always embody myself, right? I mean, I'm just, want to understand, I'll drink my coffee, I'll stimulate myself psychoactively, and then I want to, read this article or read this book or new author I'm obsessed with that will give me the answer to truth or whatever it is. Whereas, perhaps it's not found somewhere outside there, tensing up my brain cells, but actually just kind of sitting in the nothingness and allowing that tension. So, yeah, I feel that I also love what you said about how you can have this very simple life, retreat to a little hut and then just have very little. I mean, I was thinking of the story of Diogenes, I think is the name, where he, the Greek philosopher that, gave up everything except for his little bowl that he was using for drinking. And then at some point he sees a boy who's drinking directly from the river with his hands, and he just gets mad that he was carrying this bowl all this time, and even gets rid of that. And mad that he was attached to a possession, even though his philosophy was not to be attached to anything. And I do feel that, we can change the kind of externalities, but we can still be very much the same. And probably changing the externalities will challenge us, right? Like, just like how that author did have the awareness of, oh, here I am living this simple life, but still with that same baggage. So I would argue that probably that environmental change matters. But for sure, it's also, all this lifestyle design, or, all this question of how to design the perfect life, or how to be in this world, is maybe a little bit flawed, because it's tends to be very externalized. And the antidote usually would be, well, of course, it's not about the internal things. You have to work on yourself, right? You have to look at your beliefs. You have to, meditate, go to therapy, self-improvement. But I feel that's also another kind of trap that, Paul Kingsnorth is talking about, that then we kind of get obsessed with that cult of the self, of the, the self-love, the self-this, the self-that. And it's not to kind of, reject the self and to sort of, I feel, to, reject our existence or anything like that. But I do find that, perhaps the answer does lie in finding a devotion to something greater than ourselves. And whether that's something more concrete, like a community or like a cause, or it's the faith in God or in nature. And I do feel it requires, as you say, this faith that is that goes beyond knowledge, right? That it goes beyond understanding. Um, it might be a faith born out of pain. It might be a faith born out of, not knowing. But it's still, I think it's still worthwhile because it's still felt and experienced. So for me, there's definitely a tension there, of would it even be a selfish act to then devote myself to community or to faith? How can I be sure that it's not because, oh yeah, I feel like I'm missing something, so I need to optimize for that, and therefore I choose the self-transcendence, and will I be sincere in that? Or will I be, perhaps through the attempt of trying, find something new about myself and about this experience that I wouldn't have found out just through knowledge or theoretical understanding. So yeah, I feel that, and I don't think it's something you can really force either. But I do feel there's something there, and I do feel that, in this world, it's becoming increasingly harder to find a communal bond because we are all over the place, literally, with, nomadism being the normal way of living, us being on the screens, us kind of going between all, like, changing so many professions and religions and spiritual faiths, that it's like, wow, well, how do I find my one way, my one people, my one place, my one, prayer, whatever it is. And I think it's a quest, and maybe, it's maybe it's all fair enough, right? Like the book of The Alchemist of Paulo Coelho, like, he goes on this whole journey just to come back to where he was and to find that the treasure was there all along. Sorry for the spoiler. But it's a metaphor that maybe, yeah, it's already here, but we also need to go on that journey and go far and explore and get lost, and to ultimately kind of come back. And it was a lot simpler. So yeah, it's I don't think we need to come up with an answer here. I think we just need to sit in that tension and kind of see what arises or what doesn't arise, and just be with it.
Yeah. Yeah, I like that. I think we've opened up a lot of explorative pathways in this conversation, but we've kind of glued together some of the main themes. What are these tension points that are fairly universal and fairly relevant to modern people? The tension between wanting to be in a place and wanting to travel, wanting to have routines and just earn a stable living, and wanting freedom and wanting to have time to do it your own way and to create. And yeah, there's so many inner conflicts that are just part of the story arc of a human life, and that's just part of the human experience. I think I have a good idea about how we can sort of bring, a non-conclusive resolution here, because I brought up Hojoki, and in that book, I won't offer any spoilers really. I mean, I would recommend reading it. The whole book is quite enjoyable. But I wrote an essay about it at one point, and my conclusion in the essay was sort of like a friendly disagreement with his conclusion, because he ends dissatisfied in some sense, and he's like praying to one of the gods of one of the Japanese worldviews, and he sort of says, like, I failed, basically, like, I tried to find some kind of enlightenment, basically, and here I am, still just this fool escaping to my hut. Like, I thought becoming a recluse was going to be like people think becoming a monk might be the path to liberation, and like, oh, you finally let go of all your possessions, and maybe you're still just attached to trying to become enlightened. And so he sort of felt like he had failed, and yet my outlook was, here I am 800 years later reading his book, appreciating its substance, and it's very rich in meaning to me. So I think he succeeded in this very profound way. He created something lasting, something that has this lasting meaning and significance, and value to other people, even though, maybe he felt kind of um, restless and tortured by the whole predicament. So I feel like that's all we can do. We can ask the questions, and we can search, and we can converse about them. And this conversation felt really good to me to have, because I don't always get to search this deeply into these topics with people. So I really appreciate the willingness that you have to live in that tension of contemplating, without grasping at like premature conclusions. And I think that's really valuable. I think that actually it's probably really helpful to a lot of people who they kind of want to search more and let go of conclusions that feel insufficient, instead of just kind of grasping at something. So I think that this conversation will probably be um, encouraging to people listening. And you also mentioned to me recently that you're in pursuit of maybe spending more time writing some essays. And I was curious to ask you about that for multiple reasons, but why it sort of comes up right now is that the word essay, I believe, essentially means to ask. It's a question, it's a search. And so, you're supposed to have a thesis, supposedly, when you're in school and you learn how to write an essay. And people are taught like your opening paragraph should sort of uh, give a glimpse of your thesis. But a thesis can also be more like an open question with like a theory about what a conclusion might be. But then the essay is a search. Maybe it's an argument in favor of a conclusion. But to make a good argument, I believe that you have to ask good questions, right? You can't just say, here's my conclusion and here's 3 facts that prove it to be true. Because unless it's an obvious conclusion, then people are going to have doubts or objections to it. And so to argue your perspective, you've got to take those objections into consideration and contemplate them and live in that tension. So,
But things with the audio is happening. Let's change that cable.
okay, hopefully that's better.
Yeah. Sounds
Excellent.
good.
Okay. So yeah, I'm not sure where I cut off there. I was talking about writing essays.
Yeah, that it's also an exploration and difference with the thesis and
Yeah. So yeah, I'm curious why why you've decided you want to maybe write some essays, and then I also just wanted to say it might be very interesting to see how things unfold, because that's been on my mind as well. Instead of trying to produce endless content, and write all these newsletters, I've sort of wanted to step back and ask deeper questions and write some real essays. So maybe you and I will have some interchange and feedback in the questions we're asking going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's I've always enjoyed writing, but I feel the format that I naturally found myself writing is kind of philosophical essays. And I say it like that is maybe it's more just, journaling my thoughts on paper for my own, for the sake of my own understanding without necessarily that hard-coded essay structure. But I do want to kind of offer those formed thoughts or explored questions to the audience, and definitely not as a kind of prescription, because I do feel content these days tends to be very prescriptive, and I'm becoming more and more allergic to that. Or when people have these kind of and it works, of course, like people are looking for answers. So it's as someone who studied the psychology of copywriting, it makes sense. But where I find more richness is in the questions, as in the exploration. And yeah, essay, I suppose, does mean a question, but I do know that essayer in French is to try. So an essay would be an attempt. So I guess it's an attempt to answer a question, or an attempt to explain something. And yeah, for me, I feel a very good question is much richer than a very good answer, because reality is so rich that I feel any answer, any belief, any sentence is reducing it too much, whereas a question leaves the mind open to possibility. And maybe poetry gets kind of close with it, because there's so much space there that it can create. So yeah, I have this renewed inspiration to write. And so essays, it might be poetry. I might even come back to the idea of writing fiction, if I can really commit to writing a body of work. And it's a fun experiment. And I'm particularly inspired to write without AI, because I feel something has lost, or I've lost something along the way when I started to use more and more AI, especially for the more kind of tactical, consistent content. It's become very easy. Of course, it produces. I can have all the volume that I need, but I've lost the enjoyment of writing things myself, which I've been coming back to. So yeah, maybe still using it sometimes to find the words that I'm trying to name, or to find recommendations of books to read, but definitely not having it write for me, and probably not even edit for me, but just kind of really focus on my own writing. And yeah, so I'm excited to also see where it goes with your essays and your writing, and for sure we can support each other and give each other feedback or ask each other questions. I've enjoyed this conversation, because I do feel that you're also very open to being in attention and exploring, and that makes the conversation really rich, from the depth of your questions to the explorations you've done yourself, and to the experience that you bring here, and then that allows us to kind of ping pong like this, and ultimately probably arrive nowhere, but nowhere is probably where we want to be, kind of. So yeah, it's been fun.
Yeah, man, I really enjoyed this. Spent all the mental energy I have for this morning, so I'm gonna close my eyes and relax the mind shortly here. And I think we laid great foundation for some of the questions that I want to ask in upcoming essays. So really appreciate you spending this time with me, Nik. It's been a great time, and I'll be excited to read what you produce next.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Jesse.
Thank you, Nik. Okay, let's talk soon. Take good care. Bye for now. Thanks for tuning in, everybody.
Thanks.